This is really excerpts from our, actually the final term of architecture school. So this is thesis year, goes through a extensive cost module, basically full credit course. And is kind of their last element that they look at, that's kind of on the non-theoretical side, not on the design side, but on the kind of tactical stuff. So I've just grabbed some slides from there and I'm going to zoom through some of them. If you find yourself falling asleep a little bit, all I really want you to do is pay attention to like really pretty much the last slide, which I'm going to say now wake up for this part. So some objectives I have is really to understand the types of methods of cost construction estimation and cost control, how cost construction estimating and budgeting form part of building planning and construction and design process, understand the project management of cost estimating and budgeting for a project, and how and when to use different cost strategies. And again, you're going to get a kind of fire hose version of this, and always we can revisit this at a different time. And understanding fundamental components of construction costs and applying this knowledge to understanding design problems. So quick little diagram from Altus, which is a national professional cost estimating organization, and just an analysis of what makes up about 3/4 of the total cost of the hard cost. That's kind of the building construction cost. So doors and windows, electrical, general conditions, finishes, mechanical, and concrete. So it's just a little breakdown of different components, because when we look at where we can save money, we start to want to understand how the different components actually impact the total cost. And that was just a little teaser, and some of these slides are going to be a little bit wonky. When we are looking at any element in a building, like those elements I just showed you there, we're looking at what changes those elements and from a cost perspective. And there are a number of variables, some principal variables and also some secondary variables. So if we're looking at something like foundations, a principal variable of a foundation of building is the footprint of the building. You know, that print of the building, you know, if you drew a perimeter around it, that footprint, obviously, if it changes, is a driving factor of the cost of a foundation. But there are other variables like soil conditions, site configuration, the water table, seismic zone that you're in, because that, of course, would influence what kind of concrete you'd have to have in your foundations. The weight that's supported, the soil disposal when you excavate, and the type of grade slab, the slab that would sit on top of that for your floor. So without getting into the details or needing you to pay attention to these things, what you want to take away from what I'm just reeling through very quickly here is that for any system, there are a number of variables, primary and secondary, that impact the cost of that particular system. So when we're looking at any particular system as designers, we are concentrating, how can we modify or change or simplify or exploit an opportunity or mitigate or minimize a risk when we're looking at any particular element to control costs. So this is what we're looking at every time we're looking at designing any structure. And this is kind of the second page of it, into plumbing, HVAC, fire protection, electrical, general conditions, site work, and even attitudes, like the approach to risk. And a secondary variable there being the owner's capacity for innovation, the owner's attention to budget, the skill set of all the team members, leadership and teamwork, et cetera, et cetera. So just to give you a little overview there with these slides, that we're always thinking about these variables. Now I've brought in an excerpt from an assignment that is given to our master's students. And this is really comparing a plan A and a plan B of the same size, both of them 100 square meters. So you can see the first one is 10 by 10 and the green one is 5 by 20. Both of those equal 100 square meters. And then adding up even the perimeter on those, how that affects a particular component. So we're into primary variables here. So as you can see in the red, there's 25% more wall in plan B, even though you have the same square footage. So this is a little intro to an assignment that we do with our assignment with our students, which is We give them this long, slender floor plate. Maybe this is 18 housing units with a corridor and 2 sets of stairs at the end. The drawing you see at the top is just the same thing, but it has breakaways, so it's to scale for the purpose of the assignment. So we give our students this assignment, and then we say, well, look at this, and how could you make this more cost effective? So considering this, and then this is the kind of recap after the assignment's been handed in, and the 2 days have gone by and the students pass in the assignment, then we do the recap here. So here's one way of doing it, making that same thing a 2-story footprint, and basically doing what we call double loading the corridor. And another one, which is a 3-story footprint, same amount of units, same functional criteria, but double loading it over 3 stories for the next one. And then we look at how do these different configurations for the same program of 18 units impact things like the perimeter, the footprint area, the exterior wall area, and look at what do each of the components add up to. Some of these components are more expensive. Concrete is more expensive, let's say, than siding. So we look at different variables and different impacts of how we manipulate the same program in a different way to save or spend more money on different components. Again, I'm not going to get into the details of this because I could probably spend my whole presentation on these 2 slides. But just to give you a little sense that we're always looking at different ways to approach any project from a cost perspective. It's very, very important. Now, it's not the most important thing because saving money on building something isn't nearly as important as the cost of living with something that's horrible for the next 50 years. So it's this is only one variable when we're looking at design. I'm going to dive into a little bit more on types of cost estimating and key factors. And just again, looking at, I'm going to skip this one because I know I'm going to go over time if I don't. Looking at the role of an architect on a project. So these are just some tags that we talk a lot more in detail about. The control of the design, in many minds, is the control of cost. So controlling what you design controls the cost. And I often use the analogy of going grocery shopping, or the analogy of having a dinner party or throwing a wedding, and how you plan and control costs as you do the planning. And I can get into that in a lot more detail, but I won't spiral into that. Another way to look at cost and control of costs is preserving the design. So the idea here for an architect or a whole project team, including an owner, is if we can control the cost of the thing, then we can conserve or preserve the design elements that are really, really important to us. So we might say, in our building, we have to have a really beautiful lobby. Well, the thing that's probably going to get cut when we have cost overages is a nice lobby. So if we really want a nice lobby, we're going to have to control the cost of everything else in order to pay for that in our total budget. So we like to look at the philosophy that as when you undertake the design of something, if you control the cost of it, you're going to be able to preserve the things. Just like a dinner party. If there's something really special that you want to have in that dinner party, you got to control the cost of that total dinner party so you don't go over budget. And just 2 really quick examples of this. The first one, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. It had an initial cost estimate of $310 million and had a final cost of $351 million. 13% over budget. It was also 2 years late because of the amount of piles that had to be driven into the soil by the river. And another example, which is the National Olympic Stadium by Zaha Hadid, that had an initial budget, this is in Tokyo, had an initial budget estimate of 1.47 billion, but the cost estimate at the time the project got canceled was 93% over budget, or 2.84 billion. And I think maybe the point, so it never actually got built. One of the points here that we talk about in class is controlling costs to preserve the design also means preserving the project. A 13% over budget and a 2-year delay, still the project got built, and there are many examples that marginal overruns do get built, but gross overruns tend not to. So in a way, controlling costs is also about conserving the whole project. And then this little excerpt from Muskrat Falls. If you paid attention to the news, you know there's lots of controversy over this major energy project having massive cost overruns, and then this expert witness that comes in and says, "Oh, that's normal." And so that's a prevailing industry thought that cost overruns are normal on projects. It takes a lot to control cost. A couple examples of some projects that have run over budget: the Sydney Opera House, 1,357% over budget. I think it's an important one because when people think of the Sydney Opera House, do we ever think about, oh, geez, that went over budget? No, we think about it as a global icon. Very, very, very important building, significant probably to the economic and cultural development of Sydney. So one might say in the grand scope of things, a budget overage of 1,300% maybe isn't so bad. It all depends on your perspective. And again, some other projects, the Channel and Boston's Big Dig, and you can see the lighter blue is the planned cost, and then the overrun.
Wow.
When we're thinking about costs, we think about basically some basic categories when we're looking at buildings: site costs, hard costs, and soft costs. The soft costs are basically the land costs, the commission and the fees for acquiring the land, title insurance, transfer taxes, surveys, demolition, site work, anything that has to do with the land. Hard costs are the building and the interiors of the building, so all those building construction elements. And when we get into interiors, things like tenant fit ups or all the communication systems or the furniture. And then soft costs are another factor: fees to design and manage the project, legal fees, taxes, insurance, owner's own administration costs, leasing commissions, moving costs, financing, and lead registration fees or other kinds of registration fees. One thing we do highlight in our class is really it's these hard costs that are controllable from an architectural standpoint. So when we're designing things, we can't really control the land costs or the site costs. We can't really control the soft costs. And by the way, they tend to be proportional to the hard costs. And then all along, you'll see me mention this a couple more times throughout. We always add contingencies onto our costs, which are really industry standard percentages that are applied to any cost estimate. When we're looking at the breakdown of those hard costs, this is the basic construction costs. We're looking at the overhead of the contractor, and this is the construction part. So it's construction builder, the builders building the project, general conditions, their subcontractor markups. So these are all the overage costs that are added on to the basics of materials and installation. Materials being the purchase costs of the materials, the shipping and handling of the materials, and the taxes on those, and then the installation of those, which is the labor and the equipment, the wages, the rental of equipment, the operating of equipment, etc. And these really make up the total construction cost. And one thing that's really important is it tends to be very easy to talk about material costs. How much is a sheet of plywood? How much does a window cost? How much is a doorknob? But the real cost in construction is labor. It's people's time to build, and time in this where time is money, whereas a material really isn't quite the same factor of time. So if you have a delay on a project, you're really looking at those labor costs, because every day that someone isn't able to work because the project is delayed, you still have to pay their wages on a construction project. So these are important considerations that make up the total cost of a project when we're looking at the construction elements. Quick survey of the types of cost estimates. There are standard cost estimate pieces. They're basically 4 kinds. One is really standardized unit rates, and that's in the pre-design phase. And some of you have been into space programming already. You would have been familiar with this, where we're looking at what's our cost per square foot, a standardized unit rate, SUR. What's our cost per bed? What's our cost per unit? That's a standard unitized rate. And in the pre-design phase, that's really all the information you have to apply. And so you might look at what were the last 10 projects done in HRM that did housing and what was their cost per unit. If you're a developer and you're used to developing like high-rise housing developments, you know right down to the penny what your cost per unit is. And you know that that's important because let's say you build you know, a unit at it costs you $100,000 to build a unit when you build it, but you sell that unit for $200,000 and you have soft costs of, let's say, 20%, then you know you're going to make $80,000 off of every unit. So this is a really important metric to apply. When we get into the next phase of design, which is called schematic design, we use parametric and cost modeling. So that's a little more into the element and the detailed element. But that's like, what does the cubic cost of concrete cost right now, and how much concrete do we have in the project? When we get into the next phase, design development, we look at system and elemental, much more detailed breakdown of each system and each element. And then we get into the actual construction documents themselves. Before we've even started construction, before we've tendered the project, we're looking at elemental, where we're counting up every single little piece in the project. And this is all just estimating, okay? So these have classes: Class D, Class C, Class B, and Class A. Class D being the most general, and Class A being the most specific. And as we go forward, accuracy and precision increases. Obviously, as we design more and know more about the project, we have more detail. Of our cost estimating can be more precise, just like a wedding party or a dinner party. The more we know what the menu is going to be, or how many people there are going to be, the closer we get to the precision of the cost, whether we're going to serve beef or fish or just chili, like I served at my wedding. And contingencies also decrease. So as we get more precise, we need less and less contingency factored into each of our cost estimates. And this is a function of kind of a standardized industry standard kind of thing. So you can go you can Google this pretty easy, just put cost estimate. You come up with all kinds of standardized stuff. This is obviously Government of Canada Public Services, and you can see their breakdown: Class D, Class C, Class B, Class A, and the details and the kind of variances, the tolerances for margin of error, et cetera. So if we're early in a project, we say, and we're just doing a Class D estimate, and we're saying, maybe we're going to extend the runways at the airport, and we say our Class D estimate says it's going to cost us $21 million to do that. And then it comes in at 30 million, and everyone's mad because, well, when we met, we saw the Class D estimate and it was going to be 20 million. And why is it 30 million now? And it's gone way, way over budget by 50%, or is that 50%? Yeah. Well, actually what you'd find is in the definition of a cost estimate, Class D cost estimate, that's actually an acceptable tolerance. So something to keep in mind there, that precision, when we're talking about what is the cost estimate, what class are we talking about, so we can factor in the variance or the margin of error that can be expected based on the detail available. None of this is a science, much of it is an art, applying knowledge with a little bit of scientific insight. So here's an example of an elemental cost summary. This is a generic one, and you can see the elements broken down there in the left: substructure, structure, exterior closure, partitions, mechanical, electrical, site work, etc. And then general requirements as we get down to the bottom, and then allowances, and then even escalation allowance, some contingencies mapped on there. And this is like a standard summary of an elemental cost estimate. Usually this is backed up by quite a few pages of detail. And so every time you go through a design phase, one of these gets produced in more levels of detail, depending on what class that we're in. So what do you want to take away from all my rambling right now? There are different classes of estimates that are done as design evolves for a project, and it's related to the precision available of the information. and there's a margin of error that is related to how much precision is available. And that's why the classes, the standard classes are available for the whole industry to operate within. This little diagram talks about the activities in design versus the methods of controlling costs related to those activities. So just going down the design activities, defining the need of the project. Much of what's been going on in this workshop has been really based on that top circle there, and into functional program, which is the programmatic elements, what kind of spaces, and then into the design, the 3 design phases, and then bidding and the construction. And on the right, you can see historical records of the cost control methodology for the perceived needs. So that's, you even heard Hadrian talk about that a little bit in the beginning here, where we brought in some data from other projects to overlap that onto the kind of needs that we're defining, so that we have a kind of gross estimate of costs using historical records, basically. And a historical record is, you know, what are the 10 projects around town that are built right now? What are the 10 projects across Canada that are being built just like ours? And then we apply a geographic factor. And so I guess the point here is, with every design activity as the project goes forward, there is an associated cost control methodology that has to do with like documentation, standardized procedures and processes. Put up this slide so that everyone has a moment to reflect that a budget is not an estimate, and an estimate is not a budget. The budget is the money that you have to spend, and an estimate is how much is it going to cost. So again, my wedding party, I might spend, you know, $500 a person. That's going to be my budget. Or I might spend 500, like my wedding total. And then the estimate is going to be, when you add up all the pieces, what's this going to cost? Oops, it's going to cost $510. So an estimate is done based on the material and the information provided about the project at that time. A budget is what you set out. We're not spending a penny over this. So one thing that happens when we're defining your projects is we're looking at, so how much do we think this thing will cost? Well, let's look at some historical data. It looks like this project is going to cost $20 million. Okay, well, let's apply to government. That's an estimate. Okay, so then let's apply to government and some other agencies, and we'll get them to give us some money. And they say, okay, we're going to give you $20 million, but not a penny more. Now that's a budget. It's a budget based on an estimate. But the estimate is inaccurate because you haven't really started the project yet. You haven't really gotten into the details. So that's why projects tend to go over budget, because usually the amount of information that's available at the time that we're all asking government for money is not adequate. And you can look at, you know, Colchester Hospital. Just look that up in the news for one great example of a project that went significantly over budget. I think it was $105 million and ended up at a 188 or 185 or something like that. The individual here on the left is Le Corbusier, a very famous architect. If you go to architecture school, you study Le Corbusier. The individual on the right is not Le Corbusier, and those who are up to speed on, well, I'm sure all of you know who the one on the right is.
Speed on what, NG? This is a books?
Whatever you call it. This slide is that architects are not magicians or wizards. Architects can't actually control things like inflation or the variables that are going to go into the cost. So whenever an architect or anyone else is giving you, our builder is giving you a cost estimate, it's not coming from a magical source of knowledge. It's coming from a guesstimate, a best educated guess. And you know, I counter this problem quite often, like on our projects right now. Inflation is causing all kinds of havoc. War in Ukraine, uncertainty in shipping, trouble getting stuff out of China. So I'll often find myself in meetings saying, you know, the cost of steel is unpredictable. We can't even hold a price on the cost on steel, like beams and stuff like that, for 2 days before that price is going to change. And I have my clients, they go, yeah, but what is it going to be? What's going to happen? I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm not a magician. I can't predict what's going to happen. And that really gets frustrating for a lot of people because people want certainty. There's a lot at risk. And so often we're like, are we going to go on with this project knowing that there's a lot of volatility in the market around the cost? And that comes back to the owner to make a very tough decision. around costs. So this is where cost and estimating is really just all very much art, applying some data and a little bit of scientific and educated thinking. But there's a lot of expectations for magic, and it's not possible. I have a whole lecture and set of exercises on project delivery methodology. I'm not going to get into that today, but just to let you know, there are different ways to deliver a project. And these are just some of them that you see here. Design, bid, build, which is you design the thing, you put it out for construction bidders to bid on it, and then they build it. Design build, which is a strange collaborative structure that only applies to certain projects really well and not to others. P3, which you may have heard about, which is basically the builder builds it along with the banker and leases it back to the owner for the next 30 years. Construction management, which is a different type of project similar to design, bid, build. You don't need to remember these. All you need to do is you need to remember that there are different ways to build a project, and those methodologies have to do with the nature of the contract between the owner and the builder. And because of that, there's you need to have the type of project delivery that suits the project type, and you need to take advice from folks who can give you advice on what the right fit is. But for now, all you need to know is there isn't one way to build a project. There's a whole bunch of different ways to contract that, and it'll shape all kinds of things: risk, price, etc. I mentioned contingencies. We always hold some contingencies on all projects. Scope contingency, that's like, oh, we've decided it's not going to be 18 units, it's going to be 24 units. That's a huge increase in scope. Or we've decided we're also going to attach a community center alongside our housing. That's an increase in scope. Design and pricing contingency, that's as we're designing and cost estimating, we're not totally done yet. We don't have everything worked out through the process. So we hold back some contingency there. We add that onto our price. Escalation, obviously year to year, price goes up. It used to be 3%. Now we're mapping somewhere between 6 and 8% escalation right now on an annual basis. Contingencies for specific risk, like we don't know what's in the soil beneath, and even if we've tested it, we think that there might be a lot of water in the soil, so we're going to hold some contingency for that. Construction contingency, which is throughout the construction phase, we can expect some things to happen. It's not a perfect process. We can expect details to need to be added. We might expect a material not to be available that we thought was available. We can expect a delay in shipping, which causes a delay cost. So we have a little construction contingency sometimes on, and project contingency, which contains things on the costs that are not directly related to just construction, but all the kinds of other costs. A simple one there might be, oh, geez, the cost of insurance for this project is now twice what we thought it would be. Luckily, we have a contingency for that in our original estimate. So we start high with our contingencies, and as we do cost estimates through the project, we work those down to lower and lower. And of course, that's as the risks in the project decrease because we know more and we've done more through the project, our contingencies can be lower. Some other factors are location, geographic location. Then in a rural in an urban situation, a location factor is there's not enough place to put the construction materials because you're on city streets and you're blocked in. So we all know what that is like with the scaffolding over the sidewalk and everything. Well, the truck comes with a delivery of steel beams. Where do you put them? And so there's a premium cost to figuring out how you're going to do that. So always some location factors to consider. We do hospitals in the Arctic, and we ship our materials to the Arctic. We get 67 days of free ice free, and the materials come from Montreal on one ship. And you can bet that there's about a 250% location factor added on to the construction costs of the Nova Scotia construction for the same building. Now, I told you in the beginning that I wanted you to pay attention at the end, and I didn't care if you paid attention to any of the slides up till now. Now's the time to wiggle a little bit, loosen up, and pay attention. This is the one thing that I really want you to remember. This is something very important for design, and that is starting with this circle. And these circles are going to represent data that's been researched, including by Carnegie Mellon and others. This circle represents the construction cost of a project. So this is the building cost $20 million to build. This is what that circle represents, okay, in terms of dollars. Anyone want to guess what this circle represents in comparison to the construction?
The actual money you have. Just kidding.
Yeah, that's pretty funny.
Design?
That's the design costs in relation to the construction costs, okay? Anyone want to guess what this one, this big gray circle is?
Operating costs over the life of the project.
Nice, you maybe have my notes. That's the operations and maintenance cost of the building over the life of the project. Very good. Yeah. So you can almost see the difference in operating the building versus constructing the building and how important it is to make construction investments in the capital costs that might impact your long-term operational costs to reduce that gray circle. So reducing that gray circle a little tiny bit by spending a little more in the burgundy circle, and dare I say in the little red circle, may be really advantageous. And we see this all the time. For example, an easy example is thicker walls or better quality windows, right? Those are going to have better energy consumption costs, and the cost of energy is not only unpredictable and volatile, but it's expensive. So a little more investment on walls and windows could really reduce that gray circle. But I'm not done. Anyone want to guess what this yellow circle is going to be?
Oh, I haven't got an idea. Wow.
This is the people cost over the life of the building. This is the cost of people occupying the building. The cost of people getting to work, the cost of people working, the cost of turnover, of unhappy people, of productivity. Planning, design, construction, operations, and maintenance are only 5% of the cost of a facility, according to Carnegie Mellon. 95% of the cost is the people or function that occupy the space. A productivity improvement of 3.8% would pay for the entire facility. Why I like this slide a lot is because the first thing that gets cut in projects is the wonderful skylight over the main entrance or in the common area, or that great big fireplace with the nice warm feeling hearth with the nice stone that makes me feel good. Or the good quality lighting over my workspace that is balanced by natural lighting and I have lots of control over it. Or my ability to control temperature where I am sitting or where I'm sleeping. If I can control temperature a little bit, I'm not always freezing or I'm not always too hot, but I have a little bit of control because someone invested in the right system. They didn't just put electric baseboards in. They thought about the system. They thought about the quality of the lights. They didn't just put the baseline, let's just get her in kind of lights off the shelf. They thought about the fixture and how it was going to relate to how it's going to use it. I'm likely to stay there. I'm likely to like it better. I'm not going to move out. I'm not going to quit my job. And those are the real costs. So this is really key information and how I try to argue that we should just hold fast and get those skylights in. We should just use good windows. We should have some good blinds on there. We should consider the acoustics when we're designing the space. And we want something that feels nice. And if we can't quite afford it, what I always say is money is the only abstract thing in a project. besides maybe the way people feel. Money does not exist. And I think that that's a dangerous thing to say too loudly, but it actually doesn't friggin' exist. The building exists. The building exists for the next at least 50 years. And you have to live with that thing every day, every hour, for that time. And so making a bad decision in the design, let's find the cheapest designer. Let's find the cheapest way to build this thing, has a life of impact and an enormous cost. And I just think that that's so critical in the kind of to and fro and the intensity. Now, I'm not saying blow the budget. I'm saying often you can, it sounds harder, but you can actually find the money with less effort than all of the loss that you're going to incur over the life of that building. And I'll just say this, I did show you some slides like the CMHR, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and its budget overages. That building, I'm a trustee at that museum. And I can tell you after opening in 2014 and now it's 2022, we are still paying down the debt for that overage. But we're doing it. It's manageable. The building's a lot more livable and I have some great alabaster in it that's just absolutely incredible. I'm not saying that I would recommend blowing the budget again, but I am saying that it's usually possible to find the money. And I don't treat certainly money with any disrespect or budgets. I'm not saying be flagrant. I'm saying I have noticed that sometimes you can go and ask for money and get it. So that ends my little presentation. As I mentioned, I've got a whole bunch of slides on project delivery. I'm looking to see if you ever really want to get into what is the contracting structure of these project delivery methodologies. Hadrian said I wasn't allowed to do this. So sorry, Hadrian, it's like my only chance to glow. And I will stop now. A big question for me is, should we have a washer and dryer in the unit if we're going to have mothers, or mothers are fathers with kids? And laundry is a big thing. Or is it better to have one on the floor shared by 4 or 8 or 10? And it's a cost item because plumbing is expensive and so is the equipment. And it takes space and you have to build that space and that space has gyprock all around it, blah, blah, blah. But it's really easy to cut when we start to feel the pinch on cost. And there's going to be a fraction of that construction cost of that the burgundy circle, right? Or it's going to be a fraction of that. But the wellness of the people that have access to the laundry is going to be increased. And that's through that study at Carnegie Mellon and also at, I think it's called New Tech, that have done these studies. They're really making the case for the cost, that it's quantifiable, that cost is quantifiable. And to the proportion that you see that human cost over the life of the project, like it's there for 50 years, is about 95%. It's actually higher in healthcare facilities, according to one of the articles that I read. I'm not sure I think they, if I remember the study correctly, and I think you can find this online, they looked at a whole bunch of buildings over a period of time or something like that. And then figured out a way to quantify that human cost. But I think they all included everything from commuting to turnover to salaries, everything in a kind of complex way. I think there's no denying whether it's 95%, 90%, or even 50%, that there's a massive proportion of the building when you think about, well, construction is today dollars and the building lasts 50. And we know that even in 20 years, the value of a dollar changes significantly. So it really comes down to, like, in the heat of the moment, when a very difficult decision on a project under intense pressure has to be made, the tendency is going to be to cut the cost. And so you cut the thing out and it's the thing you want the most. And because of that, we've got to do a couple things. We had to review the decision rationally over the life of the project and figure out, wait, are we just afraid of money here? And that's a really complex and weird thing, and that's not one I have particularly figured out. And the other one is right from the first day to make very conscientious decisions to protect the special things. And so in the, I think Linda can probably remark on this. In that project, we've gone through space programs. Sophie, you can remark on when we're doing tiny home with our students, working on every square foot, every square inch to make sure that that space is useful. But then we got the families in and they said, Sophie, oh no, we got to have a full bathroom. We got to have laundry, we got to have a tub. And well, the tub isn't the tub is twice as big as a shower. We got to make the space. Therefore, we need to make sure we're controlling other costs in the project to be able to safeguard that. So there's two ways to do it. The rational look at like the lifespan of the building and money is abstract. And then every decision we make from day one, from the programming, just that list of all the spaces. Does the office need to be 100 square feet or could it be 90? And could that 90 be good as 100? Well, instead of just accepting everyone's word for it, we should go find a room that's 90 square feet and we should go find a room that's 100 square feet and sit in them and compare them. And we might say, actually, there is a big difference here, or maybe there's not. So I guess one thing is this is a very complex, interwoven, every variable depends on every other variable. And the more you understand that, you don't have to understand each variable, but you have to understand that there's complexity in everything. The better you're going to do for making decisions as you proceed with your project. And lastly, my last point on that, Lindsay, is this industry has standardized processes in place. There's a Class D estimate, a Class C estimate, there's standardized contracts. All those different methodologies for project delivery, they're all based on Canadian Construction Association standardized documents that are reviewed on a regular basis by lawyers, owners, builders, designers, engineers. There are standard ways of doing things. And the more you follow the logical, progressive, sequential steps of a project, and the more keep in line with standard ways of doing things, the more you're protected by the uncertainties that are introduced by doing things radically different. So Tim Hortons will do things radically different than a standard process because every Tim Hortons is kind of like the last one. So they're going to come up with a different project delivery methodology because, hey, you've seen one Tim Hortons, you've probably honed it over time, you know how you're going to build the next one. But something as special as a not-for-profit's housing is going to be tailored to their community and needs a different kind of standardized process. If you bake into the design and ultimately the construction, the ability to adapt the building when you don't like it. So we really screwed that up. Geez, I wish we could change this. No, we can't because there's columns in the way. Well, if instead of more columns, we had just beefed up the beam and spent maybe in $250 more on that big 10-foot beam or 15-foot beam, we wouldn't need that column in the way. And we could pull down this wall and change it where we need it, right? So the ability to adapt the environment easily is really important. So an example that I would use there is, and I could do a whole lecture on this one, which is the Grace Maternity Hospital, which is now the Women's Hospital at the IWK. Each of the inpatient, the labor delivery legs or wings on that building has a steel girder truss on it, which whatever that means, right? But really what it means is there's a big hefty piece of structure in the ceiling holding up the next floor and holding up the roof that prevents the need for having a column down the middle. And so when we did that project, I think it was 1982, we started it, was built by 1992. Usually our projects take about a decade. In 2014, we did a breast health clinic for mostly diagnostic things, screening and those kinds of things. And we renovated one of the wings. And we were able to take that whole wing, gut it, and put the walls exactly where we wanted it. So for the hospital, they were able to adapt to a totally different kind of space without being hindered by the intervention of columns in the way that would have happened if we didn't have that special girder truss, which was put in there for that exact reason that at some point in the future, this is probably going to change. And so if you think about how we might proceed on your project, what are the things that are going to be fixed? What are the things that might be a little bit mutable over the, that big yellow circle of the project? How might it change? And how can we invest smartly to, we'll just do a little tick more here, and that'll give us a lot more flexibility and adaptability over time.
Thanks for that, Benji. And I just wanted to perhaps ask, so these projects obviously are very early on in their conception. How do changes in design cost change over the span of, from the conceptual design to later on in a project? Because, changes will happen all the time. So how do those vary, basically now where we are in a project versus later down the line?
So I think I know where your question is headed, but I'm not really sure. But I'll just firstly start that say that paper is cheap. And construction materials are expensive. So when we're doing a program, a list of your spaces and the sizes of those spaces, and we're adding those up, it's really easy to change that. It's just a spreadsheet. We can fuss around with it, manipulate it, and look at the total area and say, oh, that looks like a lot. Really simple stuff to change. And we can all do it pretty easily. And we start sketching, start drawing out some layouts a little bit. I've got someone working on this layout right now and handing me the computer drawing underneath, working out the spaces from the program, and I am tracing over top because I can't use the computers. How I would change it, very cheap, very cheap. And so I'm making changes. I'm adapting the building to be more efficient, more economical, over a series of exercises of refinement and detail. Where it starts to get more and more expensive is the more you get into the detail, the more you have to draw. So a full construction set is about a phone book thick of drawings that are very big, and a couple phone books thick of specifications at 8.5 by 11. And that contains all the detail about how to build. And while the paper isn't that expensive, the people time that went into doing all that drawing and writing is high. And for a $20 million project, it's probably about $2 million worth of effort, about 10%. So with that in mind, as we go through the time of designing the project, more and more detail comes into that. The more detail that's added in, the more expensive it is to change, because you change one drawing, it's going to impact all the others. So if I move a wall, it's going to change all my floor plans, it's going to change all my ceiling plans, it's going to change all the walls within that space. I'll have to do redo the code review, I'll have to redo the mechanical layout, I'll have to redo the electrical layout, I'll have to redo the plumbing layout, and so on and so forth. So it's really good to familiarize yourself with a set of construction drawings for a project, and maybe we could have a quick tour of those someday, Adrian, one of these sessions, because I think it would be great for everyone to see what a full construction set looks like, and I could easily do that. It costs, the more we get into the detail, the more it costs. So why, what's important there is, like, when we're doing the programming and when we're doing the sketching, that's when we want to make sure we're making the right decisions and not just like throwing it off a little bit. And that can be really hard for an organization because everything's kind of abstract. What are we talking about? I thought we weren't going to have a community space. I thought we were. We were going to have a cafe, yes or no? Well, those are the times to duke it out, figure it out. And that's because it's cheap. It's cheap to do. And ultimately, design is really about decision making and probably managing compromise more than anything else. We did a house in Wolfville that has a yoga studio and a music room. And the husband thought he was getting a music room, and the wife thought she was getting a yoga studio. The architect who designed it is sitting right across from me. But they got one damn nice room. But we worked through how to help everyone achieve their objectives with a little bit of compromise through the design process, because it was cheap on paper and it met their budget, which wasn't for 2 rooms. They only had enough for 1.
Hmm.